1 year old at the time. House. And so he was listening to the radio on a Friday night. It was one of the largest radio stations in New England. It was right out of Boston, and the show was called Yankee Yarns. Talk show host was Alton Hall Blackington. And that evening, they were talking about these strange stone ruins in North Salem, New Hampshire, which is only about 7 miles from where my dad lived. And he had never heard of this place before. So he was quite amazed about the subject or the topic they were discussing that evening on the radio show, just like what we're doing right now. And it kind of blew him away that these kind of structures could exist so close to home, and they weren't well known. And again, he had never heard about it, and he only lived a couple miles away. So after that show, he was at a barber shop that week, and he was listening to. Actually, he was just waiting to have his hair cut, and he was looking at a magazine. And the magazine was New Hampshire Profiles magazine. And as he flipped through it, looking, he saw some pictures and he saw the title of it. And quite a surprise for him, it was the same place he had just heard about on the radio show a couple nights before. And he asked the barber if he could keep the magazine, and the barber goes, "Well, how old is that?" And he goes, "Well, it's 1952." So it had been sitting there for 3 years, and if somebody had possibly thrown it away, you know, before my dad read it, we might not even be talking this evening, you know, because that's really what got his interest, the radio show. But the magazine article really did it for him, you know, really blew him away. That weekend they were at my aunt and uncle's house playing cards with about 10 people. And while they were playing cards, my dad took out the magazine and he passed it around, and nobody knew what it was either. You know, nobody recognized what the pictures of the story was about or the place until it got to my aunt and uncle. And my aunt and uncle looked at it and said, "Oh, wait a minute. We were there in the 1930s. We used to ride our bicycles down there while we were dating, you know." So my dad's next question was, "Hey, do you think you can find the place?" And because they said, "Well, we don't know. It's been a couple decades." But that Sunday morning, I guess the four of them went out. My mom, dad, aunt, and uncle all came down into North Salem, and they drove around a little bit trying to find this place. It was not open to the public like we are today. There was no signs, and there was just nothing saying where the place was except from their memory. And they finally found a old road that looked sort of familiar to them. So they parked the car and they walked about a half a mile through the woods. And fortunately, they found the place. And there's a big chain link fence that's still up there today that was put up in 1937 to protect the site from vandalism and from people taking things away. And my dad climbed under it because they were all trespassing, of course. But they meant no harm. And my dad climbed underneath the fence and spent quite a bit of time looking at the structures. And there was quite a bit of brush and everything. So the rest of them really couldn't see my dad as he was walking around the site too much because, you know, the brush kind of hiding him. Finally, he came out. The rest of them, again, were outside the chain link fence waiting for him. And I said, "What do you think?" And he goes, "Oh, he couldn't believe the place. It was more than he thought it would be." And he mentioned something about maybe someday getting involved with the research study, maybe owning the place. You know, he would love to do that. It was just fantasy at that time. And maybe opening it up to the public as the museum. And my mom, of course, you know, she says, "Well, you got rocks in your head, you know." So after that, my dad met the owner. And a couple of years went by while he was working on getting the place open to the public. So 1958, he finally opened the place up as Mystery Hill Caves. And
Wow.
he leased the property for a few years. In the meantime, he had bought up some of the land around here to protect the site from homes going up. And it's a good thing he did because we probably have houses sitting on some of the astronomical alignments today. So he opened it in 1958. And by 1965, he had raised enough capital to purchase the 20 acres that was the original plot. And so we'll be going into our, I think, our 63rd year of being open to the public now.
Wow. Wow. And you know, I was thinking your last name is Stone, right? And that's sort of like
Yes. Yeah,
a destiny type of thing
it
because
is.
this is your destiny, evidently.
I think
And
so.
and I was thinking about that the other day. I wanted to ask you, like, can you tell us about the part that was part of the Underground Railroad? The
Right, yeah. So the site, the site, it's interesting. It has a lot of history going way back into, I guess, the prehistory, right up to the historical period, a lot of layers of things happening at the site. But yeah, during the let's see now, during the 1800s, a family named the Paddies were up there, 5 generations of shoemakers. And Jonathan, some people in the past have said, and even today say, oh, Jonathan must have built everything. And he was a shoemaker, a cordwainer. And his grandfather actually bought the first piece of property in 1734. We don't think it included what we call the main site. It was a piece of this hill. That was 1734. 10 years later, he bought another piece of the property that might have included the main site. His name was Seth Paddy, and then his son, Seth Jr., acquired the land, and he's the one that might have built a wooden house sometime after 1750. He fought in the Revolutionary War, and about 1778, he passes away, and his wife marries, I think, a third cousin named Corliss, and they move away from the hilltop, and the house either had some family members in it or was abandoned. But in 1801, Jonathan, his son, went to his mother, and his mother on Christmas Eve gave him the land in a quitclaim because she had already moved away years before that. And on 1802, the family moves in here, and Jonathan has 2 young sons and 5 daughters, and it's possible he had 2 other daughters that died at childbirth, maybe. There's no names. It looks like 2 babies, girls without names, possibly. So he had 2 sons, and one son died in Boston, I think, at 17 years of age. But the son that did live, his name was Seth. But Jonathan was a road surveyor. He took taxes. He helped the town collect taxes for 3 years. I'm sure he was well liked for that. And that was around the time he moved into the house. In 1831, he supplemented his income by taking in the town poor, what we call the town paupers. He would each year bid to take in the town's poor people along with other farms or other places. And he got paid, one year I think he made $360. I guess that would be quite a sum back then. And he had up to 11 people staying with him. But by 1837, that was the last year he did that. 1838 is the year we believe he started having, was part of the Underground Railway. And Wilbur Seibert writes about the Underground of Ohio, Massachusetts, and New York. In the Massachusetts book, and I believe the books were written in the 1830s. 1930s. I have the actual date not in front of me though. But anyway, he talks about a Mr. Poor and a Mr. Husty and a Mr. Donald and a horse named Nessie. And they were about 20 miles, I think, south of here in, I'm trying to think of the name of the place. It's down near Andover, Massachusetts, though, and I'll think of the name in a second. But he actually has a town, it's a small little village, and that's where they would take, the slaves that were trying to escape to Canada for freedom. They would take them in the middle of the night up to our site. It was all done in secrecy. It was all kept quiet because it was against the law to help, bring slaves out of the States. So there's actually a little, like a paragraph that describes how they would come up. Mr. Paddy would hear a knock on his door. The slaves would be given to him. And then Mr. Poor, Mr. Donald, and Mr. Hussey would take the horse Nessie, and they would be back to Shawsheen Village is the name of it. They would be back at Shawsheen Village in time for breakfast. And I think it was only like one gentleman at a time, so he must have taken turns doing this, using wagons and horses. Today, you could probably drive that in about 15 or 20 minutes, but on the highway, but it probably was quite a thing back in those days on the old roads they had, crossing the Merrimack River and everything. And then they would only stay here for a day or two, the slaves, and then they try to go on to the next underground. And there were several underground stations that they've identified, not only in Massachusetts, like the House of Seven Gables, but also places in New Hampshire besides our place. But again, it was done in secrecy. It was done very quietly because it was really against the law to help escape to Canada. So Mr. Paddy did that probably up to the time he died around 1849. His wife, Betsy, she continued on for a few more years. The house burnt, but we don't think it was consumed by fire. We think the house was actually damaged. And the house, we think, is standing down near the front of our driveway today. They actually moved it down about a little bit less than a half a mile down the hill. They actually probably took out the chimney, all the windows, all the furniture. And that wooden house, although it was damaged by fire, we think is sitting on a foundation that previously was used for a tavern, and that tavern actually burnt down, and then this house kind of replaced it. And there's a picture in the 1890s of the Patty family standing in front of that home down on what we call Havel Road today. So the house had already been moved. So, and we also found a slave manacle, and I think that was found by Mr. Goodwin about 80 years ago on the site. So that's the time probably around 1838 roughly to probably at the time of Jonathan's passing, about 1849, maybe 11 years in that time period.
Wow. So what is the earliest carbon dating that was found on the site?
Right, we have about 12 of them starting in 1967 all the way through 1995. On the hill, the oldest one was from what I believe is a fire pit, and that was around 1990. I'm going to say 1995. And the woman that worked on that, an archaeologist, she was a past president of New Hampshire Archaeological Society, well respected. She began with us in 1989, and she just retired last year. So she spent 32 years with us. But around 1995, she was doing some shovel test pits across the hill, what they call STPs. It's a way of looking for places where you should really dig. So they dig a 50 centimeter square hole, 50 by 50. They go down to the hit bedrock or pre-occupational level. And in one of these excavations, they found what appeared to be a fire pit, a man-made fire pit. They sent that material to, I think it was Woods Hole. We used Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. We also used Geochrome Laboratories, which used to be in Cambridge, Mass. They moved up to Lowell, Massachusetts. But one of those two laboratories, and I don't have the report right in front of my eyes, but the report came back about 7,400 years ago. Somebody built a campfire there, and that's what we call Middle Archaic time period. So that's outside the main site. It's very close to the North Stone, one of the astronomical alignments. It doesn't date it, though. It was probably about 50 feet from it. The North Stone itself had a fire pit that was discovered in 1989 through 1991 when our archaeologist first joined us. She worked on that project for 3 years, actually excavating around one of the standing stones. It was in danger of eventually falling over, and it's called the True North Stone monolith. So they excavated around it. It really took their time, like 3 years, and they found a fire pit, and that dated to 650 AD, so about 1,400 years old. It didn't really date the stone, but what happened is somebody used the stone as a kind of a backstop for a fire. So the stone may have been standing there for centuries. Somebody came along about 1,400 years ago and built a fire right up against it, a barn, some sort of a campfire or whatever. And we excavated down, in 1989 through 1991, and that date came out at 650. So 650 AD for that one, and just maybe 50 feet away, we have one that dates to about 7,400 years old. So kind of a wide range of dates.
Wow. Well, okay, so what kind of culture do you think was responsible for this engineering?
That's a great question. That's something that that's a wonderful question, and we're trying to find out the answer to that. And we have been since the first archaeology began in 1937 by Mr. Goodwin. Basically, they're a stone building culture. I guess that would be pretty obvious when you look at our site. The whole hilltop is full of stone walls and all sorts of features that we believe are prehistoric. It's one of about 800 sites from Quebec, Canada, down to about Pennsylvania. And a site could be like ours, covering 110 acres with multiple chambers and structures and features. It can be one structure. So 7 miles away in Windham, New Hampshire, there's a structure. It's a beautiful little chamber, and we consider that one site. So a site can be like one structure. It can be a site like ours with almost 110 acres. It can be a site like Dungy Wamp in Connecticut that covers about 200 acres, and there's some similarities in some of the features there. That's quite a big site. And Dungy Wamp was written about in 1654. A guy named John Pynchon wrote to Governor Winthrop and said, "What is this place?" Basically, I'm kind of paraphrasing what he said. So they were curious, even 367 years ago or 66 years ago, who built this place back then? So all these sites in the Northeast, many mainstream people think they were built by farmers, colonial and post-colonial, that there's no ancient past. We think it was an ancient culture of stone builders. Our late Dr. David Stewart Smith, he died in 2016. He worked on this site for 40 years. He said it was like ancient lithic culture across the Northeast that's been unrecognized, unacknowledged, basically ignored by many, you know. And yet these structures, you can see them all over the landscape, you know. One of the biggest arrangements of structures in North Stonington, Connecticut. North Stonington is not too far from Mystic, Connecticut. It's on the shore, kind of southern part of Connecticut, not too far from the Rhode Island border. It has something like 8,000 features scattered over 35,000 acres. And everything you see at our site and a lot of sites throughout the Northeast are located in that town, you know, monoliths, cairns, chambered cairns, serpentine walls, windows, all these different types of stone structures. And it's just amazing. We only found out about North Stonington 5 years ago, this fall. A book came out called Ceremonial Stonework by Markham Starr. He writes for Yankee Magazine. He writes about New England fishing villages. He lived there at that time for 30 years. Now it's 35 years. And he said, everybody's been telling me these structures out here behind my house and all over the town were built by farmers. He goes, it's hilly, it's swampy, the land is not arable for growing crops, it's treacherous walking, and yet these stone structures are all over the landscape, you know. And he says, I can't believe farmers or ranchers or anybody would ever build anything like this. So he became more familiar with some of the other structures like ours, and the book came out in 2016. Again, it's called Ceremonial Stonework. And when you look at it, you think you're looking at some of the structures at our site, and it can be other sites like down in the Hudson Valley. Dutchess County, Putnam, and Westchester County, New York have about 500 different structures down there. So our site it has some unique features in that it's kind of like the Reader's Digest version on 110 acres, but there are features just like ours scattered all over the landscape. We're finding similar type features all the way out to the West Coast. Actually, they're in Colorado, they're in California, Oregon, Washington. And even down in Alabama, there's some, and I've got the photographs and everything, serpentine walls and cairns and standing stones. They look very, very similar to what we have in the Northeast. So it might not just be a Northeast kind of, you know, thing. It might be actually scattered right across the nation.
Dennis, this is Bill. I was there. It was a pleasure to meet you on Thursday. But
yeah, mine too, Bill. Yeah.
But this was, I mean, I was amazed at the size. It's actually very impressive when you're there. Words cannot describe. I really highly recommend people to go to Salem, New Hampshire, and visit America's Stonehenge. It's a fascinating site. The Oracle Chamber, the sacrificial table. I mean, there is so many features there. I was there. Normally, Dennis, what it was to take maybe an hour and a half to go throughout the whole site, but it took me over 3 hours.
That's right.
3 hours,
because
because there's so much to look at. But the thing that I saw when I first walked in, because he has an area where he has artifacts in the front, a gift shop, etc. But then there's this poster. He's got a big thing on the floor on display, and it talks about Goodwin, because there's a lot of people out there that make claims that these stones were placed there by Goodwin. Now, I am going to share on the screen some of the photos that I took while I was there so people can understand, and maybe Dennis can give a little bit more background. They have photos, and Dennis has, I mean, thousands and thousands of documentation files up in his office, which unfortunately I couldn't get to at that time, but I'm sure I'll be visiting again in the future. But
absolutely, yeah.
It is so clear that these structures were already there. What had to happen was, Ramona, they had to clean out the debris. They had to, just to make the area more recognizable to actually what the structures were at the location.
Wow.
So, I mean, it must have taken a lot of time and effort for them to remove all that debris, the covering, the sediment that was created over time. I mean, he took core samples. He's done so much incredible work. When I was there on Thursday, he's constantly working on the site. He was out there removing debris from when the forestry came in and cleared up portions of his location. I mean, you can see how beautiful when you're standing at one of these stones, the solstice stones, and they've done the clearings where I'm getting the chills just talking about it, where you can actually see the solstice locations. And that's not, they have all types of different type of stone markings for different things, They have one for May Day. They have one for the first day. I forget this for the moon. There's so many astronomical locations on the site. It takes time to go. Like I took pictures of everything because I was, when you go someplace
You were
that you're
awestruck. That's what,
yes,
you
yes.
know, you were in awe.
And I'm
Eh,
looking at some of the things, the structure itself. I'm wondering, did they cook there like I showed you earlier before we went on the air on the video? Or is this an area where they drain the water from the actual site? If you really do an analysis of location, there's so much information right there in front of you in real time. And there, in my opinion, and Dennis could get more into the science because he's actually waiting for a sample. I think he mentioned in November that's coming back, hopefully. They're so.
Bill,
Go ahead, Dennis.
I was going to say, Bill makes some wonderful points there about what went on there, starting when Mr. Goodwin came in, and some people, say if they're a little skeptical or they're a little negative about the place, or maybe Mr. Goodwin stood a lot of it up. But the thing is, we have 4 photographs. I showed 2 to Bill, and the other 2 are up in our archives.
I'm showing them now.
Photographs.
I'm showing them now.
Yeah,
Dennis.
from 1920, and they're actually in the back of these. We actually have the actual original, photographs, and on the back of them is written like a code. They actually put like in blue ink this different coding on them. Somebody coded them, And we got those from a woman in Florida, and her family used to live up here, and she came up here, I would say back before 2003, because they ended up in my dad and David Goldsworth's book from 2003 about this place, and we are doing a new updated book. We have 1 photograph, we believe, from 1916, so 4 from 1920, and then Haverhill, in Haverhill, Mass. Is a newspaper, the Haverhill Gazette, and we have a gentleman named Reverend Ward, and he's standing down on the southeast corner of the site, what we call the paddy area, looking back at the whole site in 1935. So there's a picture of him with the site behind him, and that's a year before Goodwin ever visited the site. So there's the site already sitting there, and there's debris and there's brush and trees. And then Mr. Goodwin visited it, and actually there's a nice kind of like awestruck like Bill was, and he puts out this really nice, like a paragraph of what he saw when he first saw the site. He was blown away by it too. And then in 1937, he bought the site. He put up the chain link fence that's around the site that my dad had to climb under. And the fence is a green fence. It's in wonderful shape, even 84 years later. And again, the fence was put there with barbed wire on top of it to protect the site from vandalism, from people taking things away. He actually had the barbed wire on top. It's on an arm like, and he had the barbed wire kind of tilted inwards to keep people from taking artifacts out, I guess. But you can see exactly what Goodwin did. And his right-hand man, the gentleman that actually introduced Goodwin to the site, was Malcolm Pearson. And Malcolm Pearson's a gentleman that my dad bought the property from. In 1950, Mr. Goodwin died, and Malcolm was willed the site by Goodwin. And Malcolm did some research on it with the Early Sites Foundation during the 1950s. And then my dad heard about it, met Malcolm Pearson, and eventually opened up the business, like I mentioned, in 58 and purchased it in 65. But Malcolm was a professional photographer. That's what he did for a living. So as soon as he came up here, he was clicking his camera right away in 1936 before Goodwin owned the site. And of course, during all the cleaning and some of the restoration and everything that went on afterwards. And Malcolm's family actually owned the Upton Chamber, which is in Upton, Massachusetts. It looks like a igloo, I guess, all made out of stone. It looks, and if you're familiar with passage graves in Europe, the ancient passage graves with kind of a beehive chamber inside. I can think of Newgrange. I've been to Newgrange in Ireland. The inside of it kind of looks like the Upton Chamber. And that's one of the chambers they did optically stimulated luminescence testing. Dr. David Stewart Smith, I mentioned earlier, he actually was doing the cores. I got pictures of him taking the cores 10 years ago this year. And it took 5 years to get the results back. And in Denver, the USGS out in Denver actually was doing the processing. But he had to wait a half a decade to get the results. And I believe Dave saw the results because he passed away in 2016, the year that the results came out. I think he did. And the results on the entrance of that chamber, the most recent date was 1480 AD. And that date only says the structure was standing there. The entrance was standing there. It doesn't really date when they built it. It was already standing when that earthen material, that sediment, they actually can date dirt. What they date is when the dirt saw the light the last time. So you build a structure, and then the dirt very slowly accumulates around the structure. Well, they got a core, a couple cores, and they have some older samples too. So it takes quite a bit to process. They're down to about a year now. When they take a core, it's about $1,000 per sample, and they send it to the laboratory. They do all these things, and then they have these little dosimeters they leave in the ground where the core came out of, and it measures, I guess, radioactivity. And this just today, the New England Antiquities Research Association that was involved with our testing 1 year ago today on 9/11 was up today removing the dosimeters from the holes. They took 4 cores here, and we found 3 dosimeters. One's missing, and they actually take that back to the laboratory, and they use that to calibrate the dates. So they've done 22 places across the Northeast in the last couple of years. But that one 10 years ago was one of the first I've ever heard of being OSL, the optically stimulated luminescence dated. And again, it wasn't built by colonial farmers, post-colonial farmers. It was there before Columbus came over. So it's not a colonial, root cellar or something, as you'd like to hear. They have older dates on that structure, and I think I talked to them today, and they may get back to doing some more optically stimulated, just to double check. You always want to double check things, because sometimes there's errors, mistakes. So they'd like to get back to it, but again, it's a very expensive process. And they have done 22 places from Pennsylvania to New Hampshire, and the results should be coming out, as Bill said, in November. Dr. Feathers from the University of Washington should be here on the East Coast. But I heard today that the NERA meeting, they have it twice a year, and the next one is down at North Stonington, Connecticut. The first weekend of November, they may end up canceling it because of the COVID problem. They're not sure. They're going to have a meeting tomorrow on Sunday, and then we're going to find out, because I plan on being there, and he's going to be a keynote speaker. I want to hear what he has to say about my site and all these other places.
Right.
So unless they do it, by Skype or Zoom or something, virtual, they're going to probably cancel, which is kind of sad. I don't know, but we'll find out the information eventually.
Were there any bones ever found on the site?
Oh, that's a good. We were talking about that today. Yeah, so going through all my dad's archives, and I heard about this when I was a kid, but I forgot about it. In 1968, a woman from one of the high schools, Timberland, I think, she took some samples from here, and I guess she drove them to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And there was a woman down there. She is a forensic doctor of physical anthropologist. Dr. I think of her name, Hoyen, I think her name is Dr. Lucy Hoyen. And she looked at several samples, 3 that came from the main site, and a couple other bones that came from the watch house. And by the way, we just took 1 core for the OSL from in front of the watch house too. That chamber is amazing, actually. And I think, Bill, you saw number 2, the watch house, on Thursday when you visited us.
Yes.
That structure is a satellite chamber. Goodwin did work on that chamber. Most of his work was on that chamber in the main site. And he did a little bit on the lower well. But he didn't really get involved with any of the astronomical alignments, even though he was aware of those. Some people say, oh, maybe Mr. Goodwin stood him up, So there's several bones from the watch house. One of them, actually, we have on display. It has a drill hole through it. We believe it was used as a pendant. Found with that it's a tiny little bone, probably from a bird. It's about 2 inches long, maybe 1.5 inches long, I guess, with a drill hole. And then a piece of stone that looks triangular in shape and has a drill hole in it, too. These are both found in the watch house. So that was kind of interesting. It's like, were these something placed with a burial? Were these something somebody wore, and they just fell off in there? So we have those 2. But they also found some other bones. And the guess on one of the bones was it was bison or buffalo. And Dr. Hoyen, she showed it to one of her colleagues. She didn't say where it came from, and he identified it as buffalo. And then she said it came from New Hampshire. And she goes, he wasn't totally surprised. He goes, in prehistoric times, buffalo were up in this area. So that was kind of interesting. But the ones that came from the main site, and I have the letter in my file. I wish I had it because I read the whole thing to you. It'd be very quick. But she wrote a letter explaining their analysis and everything on these 3 bones that she believed were human. She goes, they're denser bone material than I would expect for human beings. But she goes, I believe these are human. And then at the end of it, she mentions that off the record kind of thing, my personal feeling is that these are human bones. And they had markings on the bones that were done where the person was still alive.
Oh,
now,
my.
the problem was they were found in the 1930s. they were in Mr. Goodwin's collection, I believe Malcolm Pearson, and then eventually my dad, and then they were on display in our visitor center, probably in 1958 when we opened. When you want to do radiocarbon dating, you have to take the sample and put aluminum foil around it and protect it from any of the outside elements. They were not. They were exposed to everything. So radiocarbon dating wouldn't be something that we could do with the technology we have, particularly in 1968. But a thought came to me, and I've talked to one of the gentlemen. He's really nice. He's on the West Coast. He's been using he's been doing DNA on some of the skulls done in South America, the Caracas skulls. And he's been using a laboratory, I believe, up in Canada. And I mentioned the fact that maybe we could do DNA with these. And I were thinking about doing that. We don't know if these will be valid samples because we won't know until somebody looks at them, closer. And then, what the cost is and how long it takes and all of that. But I think possibly DNA on these 3 possible human bones would be interesting.
Wow, really, and medical DNA if possible too, to see like what they were, what they died from.
That would be interesting.
Okay, tell me about the sacrificial table and the speaking tube and the oracle chamber.
Yeah, that makes our site a little bit different than some of the other sites that are located, again, all over the Northeast and some other features further out. The oracle chamber is orientated like the rest of the site is, true, not magnetic, but true north and south, east and west. Its main axis is actually north and south. Its entrance actually is east and west facing, and the entrance had a beautiful roof on it made out of stone originally. We have all the photographs again going back to 1920 where the roof was still intact. Some of the stones are missing today, unfortunately. So you walk into the oracle chamber, kind of walking to the east, and about 10 feet or a little less than 10 feet, probably 8 feet or so, you take a left, and then you go down the long axis heading north. And it has, if you were to look down at the oracle chamber without the roof, we used to call it the Y chamber, or the kind of a T shape, if you would, a little bit T shaped. But I think Y is the one they used to use. They used to call it the Y cabin, back in the day. We call it the oracle chamber today. But it has 5 stone closets. These are beautiful closets inside the structure. I can't imagine. Patty was a shoemaker. I have no idea what he would use this thing for in a shoe shop, whatsoever, or a farm, because he did some farming too. But there's 5 closets in there. There's also a bed. We call it a bed. It's about 8 feet long, and it's right underneath what we call the oracle tube or speaking tube. And you could actually lay inside this great big tunnel in the rock. It was all created for what purpose? We don't know, but it looks like it was a bed. It has a stone window. You can actually look into the chamber, and a person walking into the oracle chamber wouldn't even notice somebody laying in there. They wouldn't see him, but the person laying in there could see somebody walking in for sure. But above it's the oracle tube, and the oracle tube is a kind of a square tube that goes from the oracle chamber. It goes west about 6 feet. It comes out underneath the sacrificial table. And below the speaking tube inside the oracle chamber, there's actually a bedrock step. They had quarried out some of the floor, the lower of the floor, and used that for building material, some of that rock. They did that all over the site, basically. But there's a step, and somebody around 5.5 feet, maybe a little bit taller, you stand there and your face is right in the speaking tube, and it's a horizontal tube again. It's kind of square shaped, and it goes out, and the part that comes out underneath the sacrificial table is actually like a musical instrument, like a trumpet or clarinet. You know how it's flared out so that the sound comes out better, more amplified? That's what they did with that. When Mr. Goodwin found and first got onto the site, I should say, when he found the speaking tube, both ends had plugs of stone concealing it. So if you walked into the oracle chamber, you would just see a wall there, with stones. You would not see the speaking tube. And then if you entered the table, the sacrificial table, when he first came, by the way, the table was buried up to the bottom of the big stone with earth. It had accumulated over probably hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of soil accumulation. It had built up to the table where it looked like the big rock was just sitting on the earth. But when he and his crew, he had a crew of people to help excavate, clean, as Bill was saying, he found it was sitting on 4 stone legs. And when they went down, one of the workers actually, I guess, moved the stone, and the stone came out, and he saw the whole speaking tube, I believe, from the sacrificial end on the west side of the tube, looking east. And he was like pretty amazed that there's a tunnel here. You know, the stone came out like a plug, and there's this tube through there. Maybe the tube's about a foot high almost, maybe a little less, and maybe about 6 inches, 7 inches across. So he's like, well, Maze, what the heck is this thing, you know? Eventually, they worked their way back into the oracle chamber, and on the other side, they found a stone that was a plug, and they removed that. And there's the speaking tube. So it was concealed. It was plugged up intentionally. We don't know why, but they concealed it. And those two plugs, unfortunately, we don't have them anymore. You know, we don't know what happened to them. They should have saved them. But we think it's like kind of like, Wizard of Oz. Somebody would speak into the tube. People would hear a voice coming out underneath the table. It's like, don't pay attention to the guy behind the curtain. So somebody would be inside speaking. The voice comes out during a ceremony, and above the table, to the west side of the table, there's a big ramp area. And I think, Bill, you probably stood up there looking down at the table.
Absolutely. I'm actually showing
Yeah.
Dennis as you're on with Ramona. I took video of the oracle chamber, and I'm showing that, and it's actually going with your description of the chamber. So
Yeah,
Oh,
it's awesome.
fascinating.
I forgot where I was for. I thought I was there.
Yeah, you're actually narrating the footage as we're going along. I'm about to show the sacrificial table clip.
yeah. And I'm just on a phone number. Unfortunately, I can't see what you're showing, you know, I'm just talking on my phone. But the table is kind of a bell shape. It's about approximately 9 feet by roughly 6 feet across.
Wow.
It weighs about 4.5 tons. Granite, our granite weighs about 163 pounds per cubic foot. So you can kind of estimate the weight without actually putting it on a scale or picking it up, you know. So we can actually estimate the weight of some of the roof slabs, wall slabs, sacrificial table, and the monoliths and everything. You know, you can come up with a pretty rough idea of what they weigh without actually weighing them, you know. So the table is very big. It's very heavy. It has a big groove on the top of it. We always thought that the groove was a rectangle, and that was until 2016. David Stewart Smith was doing a little. We have a 12-minute video in our theater, so if you go on our website, you can actually watch that, StonehengeUSA.com. It has a 12-minute video, and Dave is on there talking. And unfortunately, Dave, you know, he passed away after that. But he was talking about the groove and everything, and he thought it might be like 4 feet by 6 feet. And after the camera stopped while they were shooting him for our documentary or 12-minute video, I said to Dave, are you measuring the groove from the center of the groove or from the edges of the groove? He goes, yeah, center of the groove to the center of the groove. So I went back up the next day and took my tape measure very carefully and did it several times. And I found out that the top of that rectangle is not a rectangle at all. It's a trapezoid. It's about 9 inches shorter at the top than it is at the bottom. And then I had our landscape architect. He's actually got his degree at the University of Boulder in Colorado. And he's really a professional stonemason. He worked with David Stewart Smith since 1991, but he's also an amateur archaeologist. David was a trained archaeologist. So this gentleman went up and he did some measuring with me, and he's great at measuring. That's what he does for a living, you know. He builds all sorts of stuff, you know. And anyway, we measured it again very carefully, and sure enough, it's a trapezoid. It was like, kind of blew me away. I'm like, I thought that's a rectangle since I was about 1 year old and first saw the thing, you know. And I think everybody else said, oh yeah, that's a rectangle 4 by 6. It's not. It's a trapezoid. And I guess I'll stay on that topic because we have been doing LiDAR up on the site and light detection and laser detection and ranging. And it's handheld. It's the latest. It's handheld, and it's about a $50,000 unit, and it can see down to about 1 centimeter. It has 16 lasers, and there's a high-definition camera. And a gentleman from Connecticut came up a year and a half ago. He called me on the phone first. He told me what he wanted to do. He came up and he spent so much time walking around doing 15 of the 110 acres doing laser scanning. Then he spent 600 hours with his computer processing all the data. And we're going to be doing a PowerPoint presentation and putting out some of this eventually. But his images are amazing. All the walls show up, you know, the 15 acres. There's more walls outside of that. He just hasn't had time to do the other 90 acres of walls and features, you know. But the table, you can see the trapezoid shape when you look at the LiDAR imaging, on the computer, it's amazing. It actually scans right out. We found out that the plan view of different structures there are not rectangular either, like what we call the chamber in ruins. The Patty chamber, it was not made by the Patties, but the Patty household sat over part of it. The courtyard where the Patty house once sat was used as a cellar hole, we thought was rectangular. And there's a niche next to the table, right next to the sacrificial table. It looks like maybe they could have kept little animals in there if that's what their intent was, If you look at all the, if you go up with your eyes and look at it, you can see it. But if you look at the LiDAR imaging too, and if you just go up with a tape measure, we found out these structures are all based on a trapezoid. They're not rectangular. The 90-degree corners don't really exist in these structures. And at the time I was starting to find that out in the last couple of years, I was reading a book including some of the megalithic sites in England, and some of those plan views are trapezoid over there too. I just throw that out there. I think that's interesting. But I have seen the trapezoid in Mexico, and I know down in South America, some of the doorways and windows, I believe it, like Machu Picchu, have the trapezoid shape too. It doesn't really link a culture, but it is something that's like, ancient people did, and that was kind of a big shock to us. Everything's kind of trapezoidal shape, not square, not 90-degree corners, including the groove on the table. So back to that table, yeah, it's about a 4.5 ton, 9,000 pound stone. We know where it came from. And where it came from is where the astronomical center of the site is, amazingly enough. They actually removed it from that spot. And then the astronomical center, we believe, was moved from one part of the hill. We think it actually evolved, and they actually built it where the table came out of. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the quarry site, the big hole in the bedrock where the table came from, you can see the shape of it, There are no drill marks, no modern drill marks, starting roughly around 1770, 1780, they started using the plug-in feather, and they would drill a hole, they put in the two shims with a plug, and they would strike it with a maul and split stone. And you can see some of it, like you see on the highway table, on the ledges, you can see those round circular done by machines. But this was done like with a star drill. You turn it, you keep hitting it, and you make a hole, and you put your tapered guides in. And by the way, we do have one of those kits, because when the Patty family was here, they had people up here taking some of the stones away too. We call them the quarrymen. So you don't see that on the edge of the table. You don't see any modern tool markings on the edge of the table. You don't see it in the quarry site. And back in the 1980s, our state archaeologist, Dr. Gary Hume, the same name as our archaeologist, Pat Hume, but not related, but they know each other and they're really, they're friends. He did 3 projects here. He was mainstream archaeologist, and usually they're the ones that kind of shy away from this place. But finally, we bent his ear. He came down and he did 3 projects. And he oversaw some of the way the stones were quarried. And with Dr. David Stewart Smith, and one of his comments is that it's unmistakable that these big slabs were actually shaped or dressed using Stone Age technology. They used stone hammers against stone. It wasn't metal tools like the Patty family would have used, any of the Patties, This is actually Stone Age technique to make the roof slabs, wall slabs, sacrificial table, the stone monoliths, and even smaller pieces of stone. The site is pretty much made out of all flat slabs that were picked off the bedrock by these people. And since 1982, we found 34 big slabs all over the hilltop, and we've been GPSing them. And these slabs are actually part of the bedrock. Somebody worked a fissure crack. They raised them up several tons. They put it like a rounded field stone to hold them up in the air, and then they would bash the edge. And when you look at it, you can see all the dimples where they were actually shaping the stones using that, percussion flaking. It's like making an arrowhead, but on a multi-ton scale. And that's what Dr. Gary Hume verified back in 1983. And he was up here about 10 years ago, and he's still alive. He's retired now, but he's the one that put his stamp on that, saying, yeah, this is definitely Stone Age technology, not Metal Age technology, to make all these thousands of stones that cover, almost 110 acres.
Ramona, Dennis, because you're bringing up so many things that's just making me think about my visit there on Thursday. Couple of things. There are a lot of stones there that I noticed that look like there was some type of etching, some type of work done on them, artificial in nature. Now, his son, and I don't know if the video is available on America's Stonehenge website, but there's a video that they play when you go into into the main area, the visitor center. And his son made a remarkable discovery on how this ties straight line latitude to Stonehenge in the UK, and I couldn't believe it. That is your son, right, Robert? Dennis, I mean.
Yeah, no, my dad was Robert, and I'm,
Yeah.
Kelsey's my son. Kelsey, like Kelsey Grammer, Kelsey Stone. Yeah, is my son. Yeah.
Now,
And,
I mean, is that video available on your website, Dennis?
yeah, Ramona and Bill. Yeah, basically, if your listeners that go to, let's see, I'm been a long day and a long week. StonehengeUSA.com is a website, and on there we have a lot of information. But you can go down and you can. There's a couple of cool things. They're like little bullet points. One of them is the 12-minute video that you're talking about. That's in our theater, and that's the one Kelsey's on. You can watch that at home. The other thing you can do at home too is you can download our app, and the app is actual virtual tour of the site. And we started that about, I gotta say, 2 or 3 years ago, and the national parks are starting to do it. If you download the app under America's Stonehenge, you can actually do a whole tour virtually on your computer or smartphone. And each structure, there'll be a picture, there'll be text, and it will talk to you. So you have, you have all of that, and you can do a virtual tour with never coming here. Although I would suggest, after you see that, you may want to really see the real thing. But it is pretty cool.
Oh, yeah.
It is free.
You definitely want to see the real thing. You definitely want, because it's amazing. But my final question for now is, there seem to be a lot of stones there that are not as of yet marked, but they look like they represent something. Do you have any of that, going on there at that location?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at everything kind of carefully. I mean, we have 14 beautiful stone windows. These are windows in the stone walls. My dad and even Dr. Winkler from Penn State. Now, he was there from 64 until about 1997 or 98 when he was retiring, and he began working here. He used to drive all the way up from Penn State in his Mercedes, and he spent the next couple of years working on this site, and then he suddenly died 20 years ago. This summer, he died suddenly, which is too bad. And he wrote up reports, and he tried to publish some things about the. But my dad and he would ride around in the woods, and I remember I was still flying, and my dad would say, I think these walls out here, and his name was Dr. Louis Winkler. He goes, Louis and I have been out there. We rode my dad had an ATV, so the two of them would sit on and go way out in the woods. And he said, these walls are amazing. They turn, they twist, they bend. They have all these big slabs of stone. Farmers built walls all over the Northeast. And they're field stones, kind of rounded stones. Sometimes they're pretty big, but generally not slabs of stones that were removed from the bedrock. Why make extra work when you're just trying to get rid of stones in your field, So when farmers built walls, they were for boundaries, for stock fences, and for field clearings. And they're usually fairly linear with some exceptions. But the walls kind of make sense, and they're all over the Northeast. They say there's 240,000 miles of walls in New England. It's the most miles of walls of anywhere in the world. And I've been in Ireland, and some other places in Europe, and I thought Ireland had a lot of walls, but New England has the most of anywhere, they say. But those are historic walls starting in the 1700s, Before that, I think they used a lot of wooden fences, You go back towards the time of maybe Plymouth or whatever, plantation, but there's a lot of wooden fences. And they start building walls everywhere. And you'll see a lot of woods today, deep woods, thick woods with walls. And you're like, why would they do that? Why would they build a wall with all this wood? Probably it was open land back then. A lot of it was burnt off. Native Americans, like forest fires go, they would burn too. It was good for hunting reasons. It was also good for growing crops when they got into growing crops. And then some of the settlers, of course, had fields too. And eventually a lot of the farmers moved out west, way out west, and these farms became abandoned, and the farms went back to forest. And then you have all these walls out in the middle of nowhere. But those are historic walls. We're looking at walls that what we found here in the last couple of years is these walls will go from boulder to boulder to boulder, zigzagging across the landscape. Farmers' walls generally, again, are pretty straight or linear. They might bend, twist, and turn a little bit, but these walls zigzag. It's like, why would anybody build a wall that goes here, left, right, and all over the place, connecting these boulders? And my wife said it's like a rosary bead wall, And these examples exist in Stonington, the Hudson Valley, and other places too. So it's not just our site. And the walls contain big slabs of stone stood on end, like a monolith, or if they're if they stood up with the long axis kind of parallel to the earth, like on end, they call them orthostats. And sometimes orthostats were used in structures like our east-west chamber, but other times they're just part of a stone wall. And I don't know of any. I grew up around farms in Derry, New Hampshire. Our house was built in the middle of. We bought land from a farmer, and we had cows in our backyard when I was a baby. We have walls there, and these do not look like those walls. But what we did find out, since Dr. Winkler died and my dad passed away in 2009, were 14 serpentine walls, and they can be anywhere from about 27 feet up to 2,550 feet in length.
Wow.
But we also found windows, and these windows are beautiful. They're actually linteled windows, maybe 1.5 feet across. They vary in size, in height, but a number of them actually have stone shutters. So they could actually put a stone in there to block it, either vertically or like little shutters horizontally. We have both, or cobbles, little stone cobbles stuck loosely into the window to block it. And it was like, what the heck would anybody do that for? The windows can be near the ground or midway up the wall, or sometimes near the top of the wall. And one of our serpentine walls has 4 windows adjacent to each other. I saw the first big one, and then my son Kelsey, as you mentioned him earlier, he was looking, goes, but Dad, look to the left and right. You got 2 on this side, 2 more windows, and you have another one, because a brush was concealing them, all sorts of brush. And once you remove the brush, it's like, how did we ever miss that? How is that possible, And there they are. And North Stonington has the windows. They're up in Vermont. In the Berkshires in Massachusetts, there's serpentine walls, and there's more of these windows. Some people are referring to them as spirit windows. And I have a friend in England, and she's really big into earth energies. And her dad was here 40 years ago, and she actually had Patrick Stewart from Star Trek last year. She was showing, before C-19 hit, I guess, showing him some of the megalithic sites. And she goes to Sedona. She travels over here all the time doing lectures. She's really quite. I was doing what we're doing right now, and I was doing it because I think Skype was working, so we have like a couple of different podcasts we've done together. And after I mentioned my window, she mentioned, and I guess it's going to be kind of quiet, but she showed me one in England, and it was near one of the megalithic sites, the same kind of window, and they call them soul holes, I guess. And a couple of years ago, I was doing a radio show out of Indiana, and the lady, she was a doctor, and she did medical and health shows. And Mark Eddy actually, I guess, got me in touch, or her in touch with me, and she wanted to branch out to unusual things. And she said, while the discussion went on about the window, she says, I was in Dallas. I used to go to Dallas all the time for American Airlines. We did our training, but she goes, I was in Dallas at a hospital, and she goes, when a patient was ready to pass, the family would gather, and they would bring me in as a nurse. And when the patient passed, they would ask me to open the window and let the spirit flow out through the window, And
Wow.
I wonder if that's what the idea of these windows are. But again, my dad and Dr. Winkler, they had their eyes open and they never saw these windows. But I think the book that you have, I have a couple pictures in the back of that book that you got the other day, and there's 2 of the 14 windows in that book. I don't know if you got other pictures of the windows, but
Yes.
to me they're very significant. A farmer, shoemaker, whatever, wouldn't build these windows. There's no reason for them unless they want chipmunks to run through them, or squirrels, or bunny rabbit. There's no reason for them, But they do exist elsewhere. So those are kind of new since 2016, just like the serpentine walls.
Wow, Jesus, that is fascinating. And the thing about all of this is we just don't know who is responsible. Who
Exactly.
who was responsible. Bill, you were talking about the inscriptions.
Yeah, but I just want to touch back. I don't mean
Go ahead.
There's something that I want to share with you, because he touched on something that's of significance. And I live in the Hudson Valley. And I went up to Dutchess County. It's a location right near the Appalachian Trail. And I'm going to share to you and with your viewers and listeners on the screen. Look, this is what we discovered off the path, up a ridge. And what you're going to see also is surrounding us in a circle. There are mounds of these completely encircling us when we're in the middle. I don't know if it's some type of a ritualistic site. I don't think that nobody even knows this exists. But I'm going to show you an example of this clip right here quickly. If I can get it to go on my other screen here in a second. Here we go. And Dennis, they're everywhere. Like you said, these These things are everywhere.
I wish I could see it in my Zoom. I don't have my Zoom up, but maybe you can send me a picture, after the show or something.
Now, are you able to see that right now or no? Or am I
I
sharing the
can't see
wrong screen?
anything. Yeah.
The
I
wrong
can't.
screen.
Okay,
Ramona,
I got it now. Hold on. So that right there. Now, do you see it? That mountain.
Wow. Yeah.
We walked up a ridge and we seen this up on a hill. We just happened to go exploring, just seeing if we see anything. Now, this is one of 6 or 7 that totally encircles us. And like Dennis mentioned, these walls are everywhere, but there was these mounds. And in the middle of the mounds, there were, in the middle, when you're sitting in the middle, you saw other mounds surrounding you. And then I don't know if this has anything to do with, I think someone, it seemed, broke the trees, like bent them and tucked them under trees to create arcs.
Oh, wow.
So like I said, I'm trying, you see how I'm going in a circle? They're all around us. All these mounds are, when you're standing in the middle, you see there's one there. And I'm going in the circle. There's one there. You see me going in the circle. So something is definitely going on. There was something, Dennis, what is your best guess? Is it indigenous? Is it Western European, Celtic, Norse?
It looks like a portal to me.
Well,
like it's
yes, it's
like
very
Ramona.
interesting.
Yeah, I wish I could see the pictures that you're showing right now. Well, just a quick question: are those mounds earthen mounds, or are they made out of rock?
Rock.
Or do you know?
A rock, I would say.
Oh, rock, really?
Yeah,
Wow.
about 4 to 5 feet high.
Oh.
4 to 5 feet
Really?
high. Oh yeah.
Wow. Oh.
Oh yeah.
I will say down in Pennsylvania, there's some terracing made out of stone because they have serpentine walls and chambers down in Pennsylvania and different towns down there. And back in '69, we saw a couple. I vaguely remember that trip down there. I was pretty young, but they did some OSL testing in 2018. It was a separate project from the one they just did recently with the other 22 places. And it took 2 years to get the results back. And they had a couple different cores, and one of the cores, the oldest core down there, for the last thing I read on it was 3,000, let's say 3,000 something BC, so over 5,000 years old. And the more recent core was about 500 AD, and the weighted average was about 570 BC. And it might be different than, I'm thinking when you said stone mounds, I think this is more, it was kind of a mound, but it was kind of terracing too, I guess, kind of like a little level. And again, it's something that the mainstream said, oh, it must be some farmer that threw those rocks there for some reason just to get rid of them. One of those stories, typical stories. And yet the date ranges somewhere over 5,000 years to about, 500 AD, with a weighted average somewhere about 570 BC. So it would be interesting, boy, if they can do some OSL testing on the mounds that you see there, if the money comes up, they can do that with that technology, that would be real interesting.
They kind of remind me of a Jenga game. That game with the wooden blocks that's stacked and but made of stone in a way, and these little, like somebody just, and you would be afraid to like take one out, that looks so spooky in a way. And because of the circle, when you started fanning around, I'm thinking of a portal entrance or like a landing strip where in between this something would come down and come out, go up in this little area.
Ramona, I will say this, and I know Dennis probably feels the same way and thinks the same way. These sites need to be protected from locals that are going to hang out there and do their partying and graffitiing, because I went to Putnam County the other day to a location. It's called Ninham Mountain, and they have a couple of stone chambers there. And you see evidence of people hanging out, graffiti, etc. And it's such a shame, the defacing of historical artifacts. And that's one of the things.
Totally.
You know what I mean, Dennis? This needs to be.
Oh yeah.
It's unfortunate.
That's a wonderful point. Even like in national parks, when you visit like Chaco Canyon, they'll say, they'll tell people to try to preserve, protect, and, basically care for these sites. Don't go and throw trash, don't spray paint. And now a lot of things in particular, some of them are being actually taken right off the walls, and removed for the black market, to sell to people, I guess, but just to love and protect these sites, and try to, cherish them, and then it's educational too, but yeah, our site has been vandalized, made all the news. And then one of my friends from Long Island, she has a really nice Facebook group, like 7,000 people in it. But she used to live in Aruba, and there are some stone structures and petroglyphs down there. And she used to live down there, and she just came back from there recently. But we've done a show together. I think we were kind of like co-guests, and we were talking. It was Mark Eddy had got us on this particular show, and we were talking. Basically, it was all about vandalism to these sites, and then it got into a little bit about the national parks being vandalized, state parks being vandalized. And of course, like Bill brings up such a great point, about that area, because that's where my friend goes to out of Long Island quite often, up into Putnam, Westchester, and Dutchess County. And she goes, "Oh, Dennis, there's graffiti, there's trash, people hanging around, they're not respecting." I hate to dump on some people, but sometimes, it's like the mainstream by saying these sites are nothing more than some farmer's construct. They're not really anything significant. Are just adding to that, because if people hear that, say, "Oh, it's just something some farmer built 200 years ago or something like that. Who cares?" And then they go up there and they, leave trash or do whatever they do. So mainstream, and not all mainstream people, but some mainstream archaeologists and historians, scholars haven't actually have done a disservice to these structures too. Not the blame isn't all theirs, but it's part of it. But they would say, "Hey, well, look, we don't know what these things are, but we need to protect them." That would be nice. But when you listen to some of the comments, like, "Oh, these things are just built by some crazy farmer," that's like our site, "Oh, that crazy farmer Patty built everything." Well, first off, he was a shoemaker and he did do some farming, but he and his 5 husky daughters probably did not build this site. It's frustrating. It really is. They say things like that. It's just, it might encourage people to go in there and just leave trash and vandalizing. And sometimes
I
people
wonder,
without even hearing what mainstream says, but sometimes they don't help.
I wonder why this country doesn't pay attention, the government, the Parks and Forestry Bureau doesn't take pains to preserve. I mean, because this is not just any little thing, this is massive. And it is our ancient history, because before, I mean, I don't know anything else. You know what I'm saying?
We need a budget. It's always about money, Ramona. It's always about money. If they had the funding, if the constituents made that a priority to protect, I think it would get done. But you need that, you need the majority to do that in a congressional setting. And it's all about the funding to protect these sites and put the money involved, what it's going to take to protect these sites. But Dennis makes a great point, because you have a lot of mainstream folks that say, "Oh, this is just this or that or that." It's not, but it's historic and it needs further scientific analysis. And for Stonehenge, what I've seen, America's Stonehenge in Salem, New Hampshire, this place is absolutely stunning, amazing. And I remember when you mentioned spiritual, I got a vibe. I was standing by one of the solstice stones, and he made all these clearings. And I know that others have done it in the past as well, because he mentioned that. But I saw like what looked like a valley below. I'm thinking, could at one time indigenous cultures been in that valley? Let's say the Indians were there in their teepees, and they looked and gazed up at this hill with all this stuff up there. And did they use it for their purposes? Your mind starts to run with all the different possibilities. And you know what I mean? It's so much to take in when you're there. If you really open your mind up to the possibilities, what could have existed, it's like you say to yourself, "I wish I were here 400 years ago to see what was going on right now, right here at this moment."
Wouldn't that be wonderful? I do that all the time. I wish somebody built a time machine and I would get in there and go back like a couple centuries at a time, and to see what happens, But no, you're right. Bill, back in the 90s, Pat Hume also, she was doing those shovel test pits across the hilltop, almost one per acre, kind of mapping it. And her husband was a doctor of geology at Tufts University, so he was great about the geology. And he came in very, very useful for that, as far as, what did the landscape look like thousands of years ago, and then all the different, what she would find. And she was looking for both archaeological and geological data. But she did find the remains down in the parking lot, where you come in our visitor center. In the parking lot off to the left as you drive in, she found the remains of a 30-foot diameter, approximately a wigwam, and they got charcoal out of there. And I think those samples went to Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Those two samples did, and the University of Washington did the calibration. But the dates on the charcoal was 2,000 years old, and I believe 1,700 years old. So that was probably, that parking lot area where you went in probably was a camping area by Native Americans. Across the parking lot towards a neighbor's yellow house, kind of on the right side as you drove in, a nice home over there. They found, actually on our property, not theirs, but on the border, a cooking rack. So the parking lot, again, we think that probably was a village, and in 1958, because we filled in over it, so a lot of it's protected, whatever's below the soil,
Wow.
So if they want to get in there and excavate. So that's a wigwam. On the other side of the hill, opposite that, on the west side, we have the glacial cliff shelter. We actually have two glacial cliff shelters, one on the north side. We haven't found anything in that, but the other one is more overhanging, and it overlooks the Spigot River, which is a tributary of the Merrimack River, one of the bigger rivers in New England. And back in the 50s, they found pottery, and the pottery out there, we have it on display in the visitor center. It's one of them. They actually put all the pieces back together. It's kind of a big bowl. I don't know if you happen to notice that in the artifact display, but
Yep.
I think my dad found most of the pieces back around 1958 and 59. They were under there digging, and that pottery, it's Middle Woodland period pottery, so it dates by the style of it. They didn't do thermoluminescence. You can actually date pottery, but you have to take the pottery, put it in aluminum foil, just like charcoal for carbon dating. You have to protect it immediately, keep it in its moisture, don't let sunlight on it. Well, they didn't do that. And this is in the 50s, even though that technology was around, it was still kind of, it was kind of in its beginning stages. So when they found pottery, they just put it in a bag, tagged it, and, and they looked at it and analyzed it, but they didn't send it for thermoluminescence. But stylistically, it dates to about 2,000 years old, maybe a little bit older. So that may have been a winter. The wigwam would have been a winter shelter, and where it's sitting is actually protected by the hills from the winds coming in from Canada, from the northwest. But the glacial cliff shelter is over the Spigot River, and winds coming in from the west and northwest actually act like coolings, almost like air conditioning. So the Native Americans may have gone back and forth around the time of Christ, back and forth across the hilltop here seasonally, But I think they were they were another layer, another culture at a later time, because Ramona asked me about the carbon datings, and one I didn't mention was the 4,000-year-old date, and that was the oldest on the main site with a chain link fence, and that's about 1 acre land. And that charcoal was found in 1971. And 1973, we began surveying the astronomical alignments. We hired a professional surveyor, Charlie Pearson. He's still alive, and his dad was the president of New England Surveyors Association, if I recall. And he worked piecemeal over the next 5 years to 1977. He went as we could pay him, He'd come up with a survey team, and they would survey the walls and the astronomical alignments. We called that phase one. Well, we took that data in 1977 and we sent it to the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics down in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In 78, we got the results back, and they said basically if these were used for astronomical purposes, these stone markers, they would work about 1800 BC, plus or minus a couple hundred years. Well, that was the same date as the 1971 charcoal. So they both agreed. The astronomical data seemed to agree with the oldest carbon dating. And they said not only would they work about almost 2000 BC, 1800 BC or so, you have 24 star alignments. And we knew we had the true north with the Polaris, and 4,000 years ago, the star was called Thuban. It was a different star. It was part of the constellation Draco, which is the serpent or the dragon, which we think inspired making the serpentine walls, by the way. And anyway, so those 24 star alignments, we knew of one. So Dr. Winkler, that's what he was starting back in the late 90s, working on those, and he identified the 23 other star alignments here. And I have all the paperwork. So he worked on that. So we have like 24 star alignments, and we have a total of about 57 alignments with the sun, moon, and stars at the site. Because we've heard from the mainstream, some of them, oh, that's all a coincidence. It's like 57 coincidences.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Right.
I could see a couple. You probably we all reasonably could probably say, I think you could have a couple maybe, but 57
Right.
with the quarter days, which is summer, winter, spring, and fall. The cross quarter days, as Bill was talking earlier, like May Day, which is May 1st, August 1st, November 1st, and February 1st. Even though in ancient calendars it was a little different day than that, a little bit later, we have those days. So that's 8 parts of the year with the sun. And then we have the 18.5-year lunar cycle, both the moon rising and the moon setting. And the next lunar event will be in 2025. It will be the lunar major standstill when the moon goes furthest to the north and south. And then you have to wait another 18.5 years to see that again. But 9 years after that, so I guess 2034 will be the minors. And the head of that, the watch house, is actually a lunar alignment. And it's also a cross quarter day, February 1st, which was Imbolc, I think, in the Celtics called it the Imbolc, I think it's called. Imbolc, I think. It's also known as kind of like Candlemas or Groundhog's Day today. Sometimes we put modern holidays on ancient holidays. And May Day, of course, is an ancient holiday. And remember, Russia used to bring out the military hardware. We had maypoles and mayfairs. I remember that in the 60s, kind of faded away, I think. But that was an ancient holiday. We have a marker for that. August 1st is Lammas, I believe it's called. Old Norwegian holiday, I guess, in Norway. And then November 1st, everybody knows that the day after Halloween. It's All Saints Day. And Halloween, of course, it's called Samhain. The ancient Celts called it Samhain, or it looks like Samhain, but Samhain. So we have all of those. We have the lunar alignments, and we also have the stellar alignments, and we have actually the equinox coming up on the 21st, I think it is this year. And on the sunrise, we're going to watch 3 different events, 3 different alignments for the equinox, and then we're going to watch the sunset over a big glacial boulder. Beyond the glacial boulder is the end of a wall. Beyond that is a fallen monolith. And beyond that is a hump in the wall, which is part of that 2,550-foot serpent wall that encircles the entire main site, 15 acres. And so that event's coming up next. That will be our equinox, the rise and the setting. So that's our next big thing coming up, and that will be on our website too.
Ramona, I got to share something with you. I must share something with you before we wrap up the show.
Yes.
Actually, there's one of the equinox sunset alignment stones.
Wow.
I'm sure you can see it on the screen right
yes,
there.
I can see it.
But this is what I need to show. And I just want Dennis to just give us a little background on what I'm about to share here. And that is that stone axe that your dad
Oh my God.
on the property. What is the story with that stone axe, Dennis?
How big is it?
Oh, no, I can't see the picture, of course, because I'm only on audio.
It's in your display in the front area in the visiting center on the left. You have a stone axe on display there, and it says that your dad found it on his home property. Let me see.
Ramon, that's a great point that Bill's bringing up. Actually, in the 67, 69, and 71, we actually dug the north wall of the chamber, what we call the chamber in ruins. Again, the floor plan seems to be trapezoid. One other thing we found is that the corners are corbel. That means that they kind of lean in towards the center. It's like an inverted staircase. Although Goodwin diagrammed the site, he had an MIT engineer named Roscoe Whitney, actually back in the 30s. Roscoe did cross-section, plan view, and profile views of the site. We have all of those sketches that he made. And Vincent Cassidy from Notre Dame came in after him, and he did more. So we even have everything plotted out very carefully. So again, people saying, what did Goodwin do? Blah, blah, blah. We have all of that. Besides photographs, we have the diagrams done by, this guy was an expert in that. But so Roscoe Whitney, one thing he mentions too, he said, whoever built this place either didn't know or give a damn about linear measurements, because I've looked at the width, height, and depth of these structures. They don't conform to imperial measurements of inches, feet, or yards. For the Patty family building, you think it would be based on inches, feet, and yards like we would use today, unless they're using, metric or something else, But we think we know what they were using. We think it was a megalithic yard they were using on the site. And it's been found in South America, it's found in Western Europe, and it's also been found in some of the mounds in the southern part of the United States, and like the Watson Break and the Poverty Point Mounds in Louisiana. And it's actually 83 centimeters is a megalithic yard, or 2.32. So we're also using the LiDAR because it can see to a centimeter. We'll be using that to see if there's a standard unit of measure. But so that same area, we actually found the 1690 piece of root growing through the structure, and that precedes the Patty family, by well over 100 years. That was in 1967. That was a carbon dating of a piece of root. And in the 1930s, we have a picture of the pine tree standing there. Below that, in 1969 and 1971, we get the 3,000-year-old carbon dating, and then the 4,000 I mentioned a few minutes ago. In that mix, they found hammerstones, rubbing stones, stone scrapers, and stone picks, as well as little flakes of stone. And if you're shaping one of these big slabs with a stone hammer, you get all the little flakes that come off. We call them spallings. That was all in the mix of the charcoal. And below that, the bedrock had been removed by, we believe the original builders actually removed the bedrock for building material. They built the wall, and then the sediment and the stone tools were left on top of that. And again, hammerstones, rubbing stones, stone picks. So people go, well, do you have any Stone Age items? Because we have and some of them are on display in the museum. And I think that's one of the things you're talking about,
Yes.
Bill. There's a
Yes.
stone axe.
Yes.
There's a stone hoe there, and the other things I just mentioned too. So we have Stone Age tools there.
Wow, here's my thing, my theory, and we've got about 7 more minutes, but I wanted to say, in doing my research, I was so interested in, like, about how old could this be and who could have done it and stuff. And, the Ice Age here in America, I'm talking, they say ended about 11,000 years ago, was the last of it. The earliest that they've dated back a civilization, I think they're called the Clovis native, 13,500 years. If it's all theory, of course, but what if it was just a civilization of some other species or people that we don't know about, that was wiped out or migrated elsewhere? Because if it was the Ice Age and stuff like that, everything's frozen over. And it would have been easier to migrate, looking for something warmer, maybe, which they probably never found. But in the aspect of the size of the doorways and entrance and stuff like that, you get a type of feel of how tall or how short the people were. And the fact that there's very little bones or, whatever that should be around there, it kind of makes me think that maybe there's a little bit of ancient aliens kind of interwoven in here somewhere, and I just wanted to throw that out because this is just freaking fascinating.
If we could DNA those bones, that would be really good for one thing, that would be excellent. I will say that bones in New England, generally, from what our archaeologists have told me, there's a lot of acid in the soil, very acidic like, and generally they'll be eaten up by the soil in just a few hundred years. But the New Hampshire Archaeological Society, I get the publications. My dad was a member of that back in the 60s, and I still get and my uncle was a vice president of that group. They're pretty well respected. Occasionally, they do find bones going back thousands of years in New Hampshire, so that is possible, But I think your idea is pretty cool. You just wonder who these people were, Were they maybe a different group that we haven't thought of? Maybe they were
Right.
maybe there were different groups that came together, intermarried, and it's still a group we don't recognize. But they seem to be preoccupied with building these stone sites. We don't think our site is a living site per se, like a habitat or a domicile or homes like the Flintstones, because some of them look a little bit like that with the stone roofs. We think it's more of a spiritual ritual in a burial.
Right.
That's what we think it is.
Or a storage
Questions
ground,
are great points too.
It's interesting because when I was there, I know we're wrapping soon in a second, but there was those stones on both sides of the sacrificial table, and I am telling you, they were the same shape at one point in time. They were the same shape because you could see how they set this whole location up.
Wow.
What was the name of those stones that you said to me? Century, Sentinel? What were the name of those stones again?
Yeah, like Sentinel. Yeah, they're like big monoliths, and some people suggest because one is a little wider at the hips and the other one's a little narrower. It's kind of like the West Kennett Avenue in England near Stonehenge. It's near Avebury, actually. I've been to. The wider hips would represent the female, and the little bit narrower would represent the male. And that's I mean, I'll throw that out there. It may not be what they are. It's just one of those things we thought of for years. Just another possibility. But Sentinels is another maybe. The word,
Ramona, I will say this: if you, because by the way, thank you so much for having me on with you tonight.
Thank you for coming.
If you ever come up this way, you're welcome to stay in my home, and we'll head over to Salem, New Hampshire.
Oh my God! Yes.
Awesome. I'm telling you, it's awesome.
Wow. I think I had one more question. Dennis, what is going on now as far as any kind of research that is currently going on there? And I want to know, are you working on trying to get the site has like a, what do they call them, national monument or historical place so that it can be preserved?
Yeah, I can answer that first. I will say that Dr. Winkler was working on getting this in the National Register of Historic Places back, what would be over 20 years ago, And he's an academic, he's going, oh my God, the paperwork involved with this. It has to go through the state, like state of New Hampshire. I think you're in Texas, right? So you'd have to go to Texas first and then Washington, D.C. to get the recognition. And I have all that file, he worked on, and it kind of just came to an end probably when he passed away. I was flying for the airlines. My wife goes, you got other things you got to do. She goes, you're gonna pull a hair out of your head like Dr. Winkler did. It would be nice. And the other thing is, United Nations UNESCO World Heritage Site would be another designation too. But we are a state of New Hampshire state historic site, and that was done in 1970. The marker is standing up about 5 miles from here, right near a Walmart on Route 28 in Salem, New Hampshire. So we are a state historic site. But the National Register would be nice, if somebody wants to pick it up and go with it, but you have to go through the state and then Washington. Our present research, I guess, is just waiting for the OSL results, the optically stimulated luminescence dating, not only of our site, but of 21 other sites across the Northeast, including down near where Bill is. There's some in the Hudson Valley, I think they took, too, in Pennsylvania, too. So that's the latest, and we're doing the LiDAR stuff. We got the ground penetration related coming back in to map my underground drains. We didn't even talk about those, about a network of 12 storm drains, some of them 75 feet long underground, and we want to map them using the radar. She's going to be in next week. She had a C-19 scare last week doing a Native American thing, and one of the people had it, and so she had a mask on, but she's quarantining herself to next week, and then she'll be up to do it. She's been here last year mapping too, so that's something to look.
Keep up the great work, Dennis. That's what I'll say in closing. Keep up the great work.
Yes, and we're going to have you back again to have part 2.
I love you on your show, and you do have to come up.
we're going to have Stonehenge part 2. And having said that, everybody, I'm going to post the links of his site in the web on my page, so that you can go and look for yourself and take a mini virtual tour. You do not want to not go there. And with that, I want to thank my wonderful guests, both Dennis Stone and Bill Forte. And with that, everybody, have a wonderful rest of the evening. Good night.
Good night.
Good night now.
Take us home, Daryl.
We're off. Thank God. Oh, what a night so far. Bill, I feel like I'm 90 years old. All right, Reverend Ed.
Okay. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We saved that. I'm so happy. That was so interesting. Oh my God.